did human societies end up so incredibly different all across the world? I mean, you have these huge empires, advanced tech, and then you have others who are still living as hunter-gatherers almost into modern times. It's a big question, almost uncomfortable sometimes. But today, we're diving deep into a book that tackles this head-on. Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's hugely ambitious, a short history of everyone for the last 13,000 years, basically. And it all started with this one question from a New Guinean politician, Yali. He asked Diamond, why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? Such a simple question, but wow, it hits hard, doesn't it?
It really does. And that's exactly where we need to start, by making something crystal clear. The book's answers, they have absolutely nothing to do with supposed racial differences in people. Diamond actually flips that old racist idea completely. He suggests New Guineans might even be genetically superior in mental ability in some ways. They certainly avoided some developmental issues we see in industrial societies. So the real puzzle, the actual mystery, is why Europeans who might have had disadvantages in other contexts ended up with more cargo.
Exactly. So our mission here in this deep dive is to follow that thread. We're looking for the ultimate explanations, pushing way back beyond, the obvious stuff in 1500. What were the really deep forces at play? Okay, so let's picture the world around 1500. You've got these massive disparities, right? Empires with steel swords, complex states.
Yeah, ready to conflict.
And they're running into tribes using stone tools, wood spears. It's a stark contrast.
It's incredibly stark. But rewind the clock. Go back to 11,000 BC, just as the last ice age is ending. What do you see?
Everyone's a hunter-gatherer.
Exactly. Everyone on every continent. Hunter-gatherers. So the huge inequalities of 1500, they're all down to the different speeds things developed after that point. From 11,000 BC onwards. Think about it. While, say, Aboriginal Australians or many Native American groups largely stayed with hunting and gathering. Most people in Eurasia and bits of the Americas and sub-Saharan Africa, they developed agriculture. They started herding animals, working metals, building complex societies. Even writer popped up independently in a few spots in Eurasia and just one area in the Americas, and the timing difference is just staggering. Like bronze tools. Mass production was really just starting in the Andes around 1500, but in parts of Eurasia. They'd had that same level of tech for over 4,000 years already. Or look at Tasmania. When Europeans arrived in 1642, the Tasmanian stone tools were actually simpler than tools found in Europe from tens of thousands of years earlier. It's like different worlds operating on totally different timescales.
That difference is mind-blowing. Yeah. It brings up this idea Diamond talks about, a great leap forward for humanity, maybe 50,000 years ago. What's the evidence for that?
Right. He points to sites in East Africa, around that 50,000 year mark. You start seeing the first really standardized stone tools and preserved jewelry. Things like ostrich shell beads.
Ah, signs of abstract thought, maybe.
Culture?
Precisely. A cognitive shift, a spark of real innovation. It sets the stage for everything that follows, and what follows is this huge expansion of humans across the globe. Australia and New Guinea, for instance, occupied around 40,000 years ago.
Which is amazing because
it meant they needed boats. Proper watercraft to cross maybe 50 miles of open ocean. That's way, way earlier than we see solid evidence for that kind of seafaring anywhere else. Then you get people moving into Siberia, maybe 20,000 years ago. And then, the big one, into the Americas.
The Clovis people.
Yeah. The oldest undisputed sites, Clovis sites in the U.S. and Mexico, they date to around 11,000 BC. And then, boom, people spread down through Amazonia, Patagonia really quickly after that. Okay, let's make this less abstract. Let's zoom in on a specific famous moment. Pizarro meeting the Inca emperor Atahualpa in Peru. That really shows the immediate power imbalance.
Oh, Cajamarca, 1532. It's almost hard to believe. You have 168 Spaniards, just 168, facing this massive Inca army, maybe 500 times bigger.
Yeah, and the outcome.
Total devastation for the Incas, thousands killed, not a single Spaniard lost. And it wasn't a fluke. This kind of thing happened again and again against Incas, against Aztecs. So what made the difference right there in that moment? It boils down to a few key things Pizarro had. Spanish germs, horses, literacy, their political organization, and critically, their technology. Ships and weapons.
The horses, I always think of the guns first, but the horses must have been terrifying. And revolutionary for warfare back then.
Absolutely transformative, domesticated way back, maybe 4,000 BC, north of the Black Sea. For the next 6,000 years, right up to World War I, Diamond calls them the Jeeps and Sherman tanks of their time. They let small groups cover huge distances fast, launch surprise attacks. They gave Cortez and Pizarro this incredible edge. Imagine facing charging cavalry with, what, a club? And there's another crucial factor, information. Or rather, the lack of it on Atahualpa's side.
What do you mean?
Atahualpa had no concept of invaders from across the sea. Nothing in Inca history prepared him for Spaniards. No stories, no written accounts of such a threat. Pizarro, though. He came from Europe, a continent with centuries of recorded history full of wars, conquests, strategies. He could read about past encounters. He knew what was possible.
So it was a massive gap in experience, fueled by literacy.
Exactly, this huge gulf of experience. It made Pizarro bold enough to spring a trap, and it meant Atahualpa tragically didn't recognize the danger until it was far too late. So, okay, we have these immediate factors. The guns, the germs, the steel. But where did they come from? They didn't just appear, right?
No, exactly. There have to be deeper reasons.
And the ultimate cause, Diamond argues, for many of these things goes back to food production, farming plants, herding animals. And crucially, this whole process started independently at very different times in different parts of the world.
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating for me. How does a wild plant even become domesticated? It's not like someone just decided, I'm going to tame wheat, is it?
No, not quite that simple. A lot of it was probably unconscious selection, especially early on.
Unconscious? How?
Well, imagine wild plants. Some might have mutant seeds that, say, lack the tough coat or the natural chemicals that stop them sprouting too early. If a person gathers those seeds, maybe drops some near their camp, those mutant seeds are more likely to sprout quickly. Then they get harvested again and the cycle repeats. People are selecting for easier to grow plants without even realizing why.
Okay. So nature and human habits working together.
Right. Then later you get conscious selection too, people actively choosing the biggest fruits, the tastiest leaves, the seeds that don't shatter and fall off the stalk easily. And you see this incredible diversity emerge. Sunflowers bred for huge seeds, bananas for tiny seeds or no seeds at all, lettuce for leaves, squash for fruit.
Like with beets, right. Didn't they start out being grown for leaves?
Exactly. Leaves first, then centuries later people started selecting for the root, and much, much later, in the 18th century, for sugar content. Or wild cabbage. Just look what we got from selecting different bits of that one plant. Cabbage, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. Amazing. Now, why did this happen so early and so successfully in the Fertile Crescent in Southwest Asia? They had some major advantages.
Like what?
First, the climate. That Mediterranean climate, mild, wet winters, long, hot, dry summers, it's perfect for annual plants like cereals and pulses, which are really useful for humans because you can store the seeds. Second, a lot of the wild plants there were self-pollinating hermaphrodites, meaning they pollinate themselves. So if a useful mutation popped up, it was more likely to be passed on reliably, not get diluted by cross-pollination with other, less usable plants. And third, just sheer botanical wealth. Of the world's 56 wild grasses with the biggest seeds, the easiest ones to gather and eat, a stunning 32 of them were native to that Mediterranean zone, including the ancestors of wheat and barley.
32 out of 56. Wow. What about elsewhere?
Big contrast. Chile had just 2. California, Southern Africa, only 1 each. Australia, none. Eurasia just hit the jackpot with potential crops right from the start.
Okay, that makes sense for plants. What about animals? Why did Eurasia end up with almost all the big domestic farm animals? Was this a similar story?
Very similar. It comes down to the available candidates. Eurasia is just the biggest landmass, the most ecologically diverse. It simply had more large wild mammal species over 100 pounds, plant-eating or omnivorous, that were potentially domesticable. About 72 candidates globally.
And the other continents?
Sub-Saharan Africa had a lot too, 51 candidates, but it's smaller, less diverse ecologically. The Americas. They probably had a good number initially, but most their big mammals, including native horses, camels went extinct around 13,000 years ago. Climate change, maybe human hunting.
And Australia?
Australia had far fewer candidates to begin with, being smaller and isolated, and most of those also went extinct. Bad luck, basically. But even having candidates isn't enough. Most large mammals just resist domestication. They have traits that make it impossible.
Like what kind of traits?
All sorts. Some animals, like the eland antelope, are just too panicky in captivity. Others, like the vicuña in the Andes prized for its wool, have really complex mating rituals that just don't work when confined. Or they need huge territories, or males are too aggressive towards each other. Even many herd animals, which you'd think would be good candidates, get very territorial and aggressive during breeding season. That ruled out most types of deer and antelope.
So it's a pretty short list of animals that actually worked out.
A very short list. The ancient 14 species of large domestic mammals. And Eurasia ended up with 13 of them. The Americas got just 1, the llama and alpaca. Africa south of the Sahara, none. Australia, none. And this concentration of domestic animals in Eurasia has another quite grim consequence we need to talk about: the link to diseases.
Right, the germs part of the title. How does having cows and sheep lead to things like smallpox?
It's a direct evolutionary pathway. Most of the major human infectious crowd diseases, smallpox, measles, flu, plague, TB, typhus, cholera, they actually evolved from microbes that originally infected domestic animals. We lived in such close proximity to our livestock for millennia, breathing the same air, handling manure, drinking contaminated water. That gave animal microbes countless opportunities to jump species and adapt to us.
It's fascinating, kind of horrifying, that farming itself created the perfect environment for these diseases. Not just the animals, but the way people lived.
Exactly. Agriculture lets populations become way denser, 10 to 100 times denser than hunter-gatherer bands. You're living in settled villages, often surrounded by your own waste, maybe contaminated water sources.
A perfect breeding ground for germs.
Absolutely. It creates this short, easy path for microbes to spread from person to person or animal to person. And these germs evolved in stages, from just an animal disease to one that could jump to humans occasionally, to one that could sustain transmission within human populations, becoming a full-blown human epidemic disease. Sometimes they even changed how they spread, like typhus, which went from rat fleas to human body lice, much more effective when people are crowded together.
And the impact when these diseases hit populations that had never encountered them before, devastating.
Utterly catastrophic. We're talking death rates of 50%, even up to 90 or 100% in some cases. Think of Hispaniola, the native population basically wiped out, from maybe 8 million down to near zero in just a few decades after Columbus, or measles hitting Fiji in 1875 and killing a quarter of the population. But it wasn't just a one-way street, immunologically speaking. Tropical regions, Asia, Africa, Indonesia, New Guinea, they had their own potent diseases like malaria, yellow fever, cholera. And those diseases were a major barrier to European colonization for a very long time.
So we've got food production differences, animal differences, disease differences. How did geography itself, the actual shape of the continents, play into how all this spread? You mentioned Eurasia's axis earlier.
Right. This is crucial. Eurasia's main axis runs east-west. That's a huge advantage.
Why east-west specifically?
Because climate zones tend to run in bands of latitude. If you move east or west, you're likely to stay at roughly the same latitude, meaning similar day length, similar seasons, similar temperature ranges. So crops developed in the Fertile Crescent could spread relatively easily and quickly westward to Europe and eastward to the Indus Valley. The animals could move too. The whole agricultural package could diffuse along that east-west axis without hitting major climate barriers.
And China too.
China benefited similarly. A big east-west dimension, plus major rivers like the Yellow and Yangtze flowing east-west, which helped unify the region culturally and politically early on. A relatively smooth coastline also made internal communication easier compared to, say, Europe. Now contrast that with the Americas and Africa. Their main axes run north-south.
So moving along the main axis means changing latitude.
Exactly. Changing latitude means changing climates, changing day length, different growing seasons. A crop developed in Mexico might not grow well further north or south without significant adaptation, which takes time. Plus, you have major ecological barriers. The narrow isthmus of Panama connecting North and South America, deserts like the Sahara in Africa or parts of Mexico, high mountain ranges, all these things slowed down or completely blocked the spread of crops, animals, technologies, and ideas.
So you got pockets of development, but they didn't connect easily.
Right. Things often had to be domesticated or invented multiple times independently, like Andean crops like potatoes and llamas never made it to Mexico in pre-Columbian times. Corn took thousands of years to spread from Mexico to North America and adapt to different climates. Beans took a long time too. Diffusion was just much harder. And this ease of diffusion in Eurasia directly fueled the development of technology and writing too. Successful food production creates food surpluses. That means not everyone has to farm. You can have specialists, metal workers, priests, soldiers, scribes, inventors. Technology tends to develop fastest where you have large populations, lots of food, and many competing societies. More people means more potential inventors, and competition spurs innovation and adoption. Eurasia just had the largest area and population connected by a relatively easy diffusion.
Okay, that makes sense for technology in general. But writing seems like such a specific, complex invention. Why did it only arise independently a few times? Sumer, Mesoamerica, maybe Egypt and China, though there might have been influence there. Why not more often?
Good question. Two main reasons, Diamond argues. First, inventing writing from scratch is incredibly difficult. It's not a simple idea. Look at Sumerian cuneiform. It likely took centuries, maybe millennia, to develop from early accounting tokens to a full script.
It wasn't just one person having a bright idea.
Not at all. It requires sustained effort and refinement. Second, a society needs to actually find writing useful enough to support specialist scribes. Early states needed it for record-keeping, accounting, propaganda, hunter-gatherer bands, not so much. And once writing was invented in one place, like Sumer or Mesoamerica, the idea of writing, or sometimes even the specific script details, tended to spread relatively quickly to neighboring societies that could use it.
So it preempted other independent inventions.
Pretty much. Why reinvent the wheel, or in this case, the alphabet or syllabary, if you can borrow or adapt something that already works? It's like the contrast between the Phaistos disc from ancient Crete, this unique, undeciphered script that never caught on, and Gutenberg's printing press.
How does that illustrate it?
The Phaistos disc used stamps, a kind of proto-printing, but the underlying technology was clumsy, and crucially, there wasn't widespread literacy or demand for mass-produced text in Minoan Crete. Gutenberg's press, however, emerged in a Europe with growing literacy, universities, a demand for books, and existing metalworking technology. The conditions were right for it to take off. Readiness and utility are key. And all this ties into political organization, too. Societies evolve, generally, from small, nomadic bands with little formal structure.
Right. Everyone's related. Pretty egalitarian.
To larger tribes, then chiefdoms with hereditary leaders and some redistribution of goods, and finally to states. States have centralized government, intensive agriculture, economic specialization, often literacy, formal laws, taxation.
And all states rely on that food production surplus we talked about.
Absolutely. Food production is the prerequisite, but it also raises that question. Why do the majority, the commoners, put up with states which often seem like kleptocracy systems where the elite extracts resources?
Yeah, why don't people just refuse to hand over their grain or pay taxes?
Diamond suggests a few reasons. One is the threat of force, obviously. States have soldiers, police. But also, ideology plays a huge role. Shared religion or patriotic fervor can convince people that the state serves a higher purpose, binding unrelated people together and motivating sacrifice.
Providing a justification for the system.
Exactly. And keeping the elites happy enough not to fight amongst themselves too much. Plus, states often provide useful services, defense, infrastructure, dispute resolution that benefit everyone to some degree. And historically, larger political units often form not because small groups want to merge, but because they're forced to, either by conquest or by banding together to fight off an external enemy. Think about the Zulu state forming under Shaka and his predecessors through military innovation and conquest in southern Africa.
Okay, let's ground these big ideas. Can we look at some specific regions through this lens? Australia, for example. Why did it remain entirely hunter-gatherer?
Australia is a really clear case study. It's the only continent where, in modern times, all native societies lived without farming, herding, metal, writing, or states. They were highly skilled hunter-gatherers, incredibly adapted to their environment.
They even practiced a kind of landscape management, right? Fire stick farming.
Yes, using controlled burns to promote certain plants and attract game. Very sophisticated ecological knowledge, but not agriculture in the sense of cultivating crops. Why no farming? Partly isolation, but mostly, Diamond argues, a lack of suitable, domesticable native plants and animals. And the climate and soils in much of Australia are challenging for agriculture anyway. This isolation and smaller population size also meant less pressure for innovation, maybe even some loss of technologies over time, like the boomerang disappearing from Tasmania. Contact with Indonesian traders brought some things, like canoes, but not fundamental changes like agriculture, because the hunter-gatherer lifestyle wasn't set up to adopt them easily.
What about New Guinea, right next door? Very different outcome. Parts of it had agriculture.
Yes, New Guinea is fascinating because indigenous agriculture did develop there. They domesticated local wild plants like sugarcane, some bananas, taro, yams. It shows agriculture was possible, even without many domesticable animals. They had pigs, but not much else large.
So they weren't just passive recipients.
Not at all. They were innovators. And importantly, because New Guinea had contact with Indonesian farmers and traders for maybe 3,500 years before Europeans arrived in force, they had built up some resistance to Eurasian diseases. Not total immunity, but more than, say, Native Americans. That made a difference when Europeans finally settled.
Let's swing back to that China versus Europe comparison. You mentioned the geography earlier, China's unity versus Europe's fragmentation. How did that play out historically?
It played out hugely. China's geography, the relatively smooth coastline, the big east-west rivers connecting fertile regions, made political and cultural unification much easier much earlier. So China has this long history of being a single large empire, albeit with periods of division.
Whereas
Europe is geographically fractured. That highly indented coastline creates peninsulas like Italy, Greece, Iberia, Scandinavia, almost like islands. You have major mountain ranges, Alps, Pyrenees dividing regions. This encouraged the formation and persistence of many independent states, languages, and cultures. Chronic disunity.
And that disunity had consequences.
Big ones. It meant, for example, that if one ruler in Europe rejected an idea like Columbus's voyage, the proposer could just go shop the idea around to other competing rulers. In a unified China, if the emperor decided to halt exploration, as they did in the 1400s, that was it. Exploration stopped for the whole civilization. That fragmentation, paradoxically, might have driven European innovation and expansion in the long run through constant competition.
Okay, one more continent. Africa. Why did complex states and technologies develop later there, generally, compared to Eurasia?
Again, it comes back to those fundamentals. Africa had fewer suitable domesticable plants compared to Eurasia, especially outside the Mediterranean fringe, and critically, almost no domesticable native animals.
Why weren't animals like zebras or African buffalo domesticated?
They just didn't pass the tests. Zebras are notoriously difficult to tame, very flighty and prone to biting. African buffalo are highly dangerous and unpredictable. Rhinos, hippos, just not suitable candidates for various reasons related to diet, temperament, breeding habits. Africa also has that strong north-south axis, making diffusion harder. And the Sahara Desert was a massive barrier between North Africa, part of the Mediterranean world, and sub-Saharan Africa.
So food production spread slower.
Yes. And because the package of crops and animals wasn't as productive initially as Eurasia's, populations grew slower, leading to later development of metallurgy, states, and writing in most of sub-Saharan Africa. You also see the impact of the Bantu expansion. Farmers originating in West Africa, who had iron tools and crops suited to wetter climates, gradually spread south and east over thousands of years, largely displacing or absorbing earlier hunter-gatherer populations like the ancestors of modern Pygmies and Khoisan peoples.
So historical conflicts, like those in South Africa, have roots way back in these differing agricultural potentials and expansions.
Deep roots, absolutely. The arrival of European colonists later added another layer, but the initial encounters between Bantu farmers and Khoisan hunter-gatherers were already shaped by these long-term geographic and agricultural realities.
This whole approach, looking for these deep ultimate causes, using geography, biology, archaeology, it feels quite scientific, but history is usually seen as, a humanity. Can we really call it a science?
That's a great point, and Diamond addresses it. History obviously deals with unique events and human choices, unlike physics or chemistry. But he argues that doesn't mean we can't analyze it scientifically. We can look for patterns, develop hypotheses based on evidence from different fields, test those hypotheses against historical data from various societies. Think about how paleontologists studied dinosaurs or geologists studied glaciers. They're historical sciences too, reconstructing the past based on evidence. We can do something similar with human history.
But aren't there just too many random events? Things that couldn't be predicted by geography or environment? Wildcards, as Diamond calls them.
Definitely. History isn't perfectly predictable. There are cultural idiosyncrasies, little things that arise for almost random reasons but become deeply ingrained.
Like the QWERTY keyboard.
Exactly. That layout wasn't designed for speed. It was partly to prevent early typewriter keys from jamming. But it's stuck through path dependence, and now we all use it on computers where the original reason is totally irrelevant. Or think about the Sumerians using a base 12 and base 16 number system Y. Who knows for sure? But because of them, we still have 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles, not a neat base 10 system like our counting. Then there are individual idiosyncrasies. The great man theory of history: does one brilliant or terrible leader fundamentally change the course of events, or are they just products of their time, riding currents already flowing, as Bismarck kind of suggested?
That's a classic debate.
It is, and Diamond doesn't definitively solve it. Individuals clearly make choices, but how much do those choices alter the really broad, long-term patterns driven by environment and geography? It's an open question, especially on the grand scale he's looking at. But even with these wild cards, these unpredictable bits, Diamond's point is that we can understand the major contours of human history scientifically. And doing so is incredibly valuable for understanding why the world looks the way it does today.
So wrapping this all up, the big takeaway here isn't about inherent differences between peoples. Not at all.
Absolutely not. That's the crucial starting and ending point.
It's about the land, the plants and animals available, the shape of the continents affecting how easily things spread, the diseases that evolved from close contact with animals. These deep environmental and geographical factors set different stages upon which human history played out.
Precisely. These are the ultimate causes that explain the vast differences in power and technology we saw emerge over the last 13,000 years. They explain why history went down such different paths on different continents, and these ancient patterns, they're not just ancient history, they still echo today, shaping global inequalities and interactions.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought to chew on. If these deep forces shape so much of the past, what other aspects of our modern world, maybe economic systems, cultural values, ongoing conflicts, might also have roots sunk deep in geography and environmental luck, just waiting for us to dig them up and understand them better? And can understanding these forces actually help us shape a better future?